Hi everybody, welcome to Adonics. This is actually the continuation of our previous discussion on AOP implementation. So now we will check how the AOP can be implemented and how it works by executing different piece of code. First, let us check with the basic type of advices which is known as before advice and after advice. Just have a look at this piece of code where I have uncommented this particular line. So this particular line. So we are expecting that this before advice method will be executed before executing the code inside this get employee name method. So what is there in before advice method? Let's have a look. This is the before advice method where we have put a system.out.println where it's written before advice start employee details setup. And this is the particular method get emp name where this particular employee name will be printed out on the console and then this will be returned. And this is the main file where we have get the reference of the main and then we have called this particular method. Now let's run this particular file and check how it works. Just click on this particular file, then run as Java application. It will check all the configuration files as shown on the console. It will check this particular AOP bin file, XML file, load the bin definitions, then check the AOP bin XML file, and then it will execute this particular piece of code, which is before advice, start employee details setup. Then this is the employee name. So as you have seen, the execution of this particular method get employee name is done, and before printing out the employee name the advice has been executed, which is there as a before advice method, this particular method. So from this particular XML file you can see we are executing before advice before executing the code inside get employee method. Now let's uncomment this particular piece of code where we are implementing after advice method. So what is there inside after advice method? Just save these changes, check what is there within after advice method. It is a simple system.out.println where you have written after advice and employee details setup. So what is expected? These two particular advices will be executed on top of this particular get employee name method. This advice will be executed before executing the code of get employee method, and this particular advice will be executed after executing the code inside get employee method. Now let's clear the console, run the program once again, and let's check the output on the console, what it shows. Just have a look. This is before advice, then it executes the code inside the get employee name method, then it executes the code after advice method, and everything has been controlled from this particular configuration file. So this is the output what we are getting. Now let's clear this output. Now let's check some other options how it works. Let's have this particular piece of code uncommented and let's comment out before advice and after advice method. This is a particular advice which is known as around advice, and around advice method is this one. So this particular line of code will be executed as an around advice method. Now let's save the code. Let's run the application once again and check how it works. Once you run the application on the console, you will see this particular line of code has been executed, which is inside the around advice method. Now let's have a look on the other type of advices one by one. Let's have a look at this particular type of advice and comment it out, the around advice method. As I have said, this after returning advice is a particular type of advice which is executed when the method executes successfully. Let's save this piece of code. So let's check what is there in after returning advice method. This is after returning advice method. So this piece of code will be executed when getEmployee method executes successfully. Let's run the code once again. What is the output? The output is employee name and then this particular method execution. That means this getEmployeeName method has been executed successfully. That's why this name has been printed out. And once this is successfully executed, the advice which is mentioned at after returning advice has been executed. This is the line of code which is there inside this method. So it's amazing how all these advices or the type of advices we are controlling just from this particular piece of code or particular piece of configuration that we have done here. Right now, let's take an option where we will forcefully introduce some exception and check whether the particular method after exception advice is executed or not. Let's uncomment this particular piece of code, comment out the previous advice and save this file. Now let's go to this file employee.java and introduce one exception here. Just uncomment this piece of code. Save this particular file. What we are trying to achieve. What is the type of exception? We have defined an array here and then we are trying to get an element 78 which is basically out of bound exception. We are trying to get one element by an index of 78 which is not available here. Here we have A, B, G and J. So there is no 78th element or an element which is having an index 78. So this will definitely raise one error on exception. This is the exception code we have written. And this is the piece of code we have written. You can put it here also or you can just keep it inside. And we will check whether the exception code is executing or not. Now let's see what is there within this piece of code. This is after exception advice. And what is written? After exception advice, after exception raised. Raised by what? Raised by this particular method which is getEmployeeName. Now let's check how it works. Let's save all the files and try to run this code as a Java application as we did in the previous sections or previous examples also. Just have a look at the console. This is the employee name as it has been printed out on top. Why this is printed out? Because till this point of time, till the execution point, we have not raised any exception. Now, once we are trying to execute this piece of code, we are getting out of bound exception, array index out of bound exception. So this is the exception raised and we have printed it here, exception raised with the exception as I have mentioned that we are trying to access one particular element which is having an index 78 which is not available. That means we are trying to access some element which is not there in the array. So it will definitely raise an exception. So this is the exception. So once the exception is raised, just check this particular line of code. After exception advice, after exception raised, that means this advice has been executed once this method raised one exception, that is array index bound exception. So where we can put this type of exception. For example, we want to log all the exceptions in a file for future analysis. So we can simply implement after exception advice here and put the piece of code, or put the piece of advice, or the exception rather, in a single file for later analysis. So that may be one practical example. So now let's comment out this particular piece of code once again and try to check some other piece of code where we are trying to implement the advice in a different method. I'm just uncommenting this particular piece of code where we have defined another aspect which will be implemented or which will be executed on top of this getEmployee ID method. Let's save these files. Let's go to the main AOP and uncomment this piece of code where we are just invoking getEmployee method. Again, we are saving this file. We are double checking whether this advice has been put properly or not. Just remember that this particular aspect ID should be different. The other things can be as it is because we are referring the same beans here also, and we are executing the same piece of advice, before advice, after advice, and a method is only different, which is getEmployee ID. Sorry, this piece of code. Now let's execute the piece of code and see how it works. Save all the files, clear your console, and run this program once again. Let's see the output, how it works. Okay. Oh, sorry, we have forgot to comment out this exception. We need to comment out this exception. That's why it's raised once again. Let's comment out this particular piece of code so that this exception doesn't rise anymore, and we can check the other part. Run this code once again as a Java application, and let's check the output. See, we are getting the employee ID and after advice and before advice, right? Because we are now executing the before advice and after advice method on top of this code, on top of this particular piece of code, right? We can comment out this section just to avoid any confusion and run this piece of code once again to clearly understand which particular advices are executed on top of which method. Now we can see there will be clearly two advices, one is before and after, and then this particular piece of code will be executed. This employee ID is 121234. So everything, whatever advices, whatever aspects, and whatever methods we are targeting as a target object can be controlled from this single file, which is the XML configuration. But as I have said, you can implement the similar type of implementations of AOP by annotations on the program itself rather than the configuring XML files. So it depends upon the programming, the comfort zone of a developer who is working on the project. Similar way, you can just uncomment these two sections to see how it works for the two methods where we are implementing same advices. Now let's go to this file, and we are uncommenting this line to see whether that comment or that particular system output is executing or not. Let's run the program once again as an application, Java application, and let's see what is there on the console. See, it clearly executes two methods, two advices on two methods. This is the first method, getEmployee_name, where we are implementing before advice, after advice, and this is getEmployee ID, where we have implemented before advice and after advice. So in this way, you can control the number of methods, the aspects, the implementations, everything from here. And you need to make all the components ready in proper places. Hope the understanding is quite clear now, and you can implement it efficiently in your application. Just try to remember all the code should be in place. Thank you.